Welcome to session 11 of our tour through the book of Ezekiel. And in this session, actually in these next two sessions, we're going to look at Ezekiel 40 to 48, this lengthy passage detailing this temple and its implications for the whole of the land and the whole of creation. Now, before we start here, I want to take a look at something C.S. Lewis wrote, because I think it helps us as we wrestle with how to interpret this passage. The very first book in the storyline of the Chronicles of Narnia, even though it wasn't published first, but the very first book in the storyline is called The Magician's Nephew. And in it, we learn how Narnia was not only created, but how Narnia as a world was discovered by two children from our own world, Didgery and Polly. Now, Didgery's uncle, Andrew, is a peculiar, reckless, and selfish man. He experiments with magical dust from another world that he got from his godmother, and he crafted that dust into yellow and green rings. And what happens is after Andrew tricks Polly with the rings, and then Didgery goes after her to rescue her, the children find themselves in a sort of world between worlds, and they decide to experiment a little rather than head directly back to England. And so in chapter 4, Didgery and Polly wind up in a bizarre, troubling world called Charn. Now, Lewis did many things to create a sense of discomfort and fear in his description of Charn. First off, the very name Charn is related to the Latin word carnale, meaning graveyard. And it's where we get the word charnel. A charnel house is a vault in a cemetery for skeletal remains. And so Charn already starts to invoke discomfort. But second, in this world of Charn, as Lewis is describing it, the light, the colors, the weather, the sounds, everything Didgery and Polly experience is troubling. And they learn upon reviving the White Witch, who features in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, that this world looks like it does because the witch, Jadis is her name, the witch cursed it and killed everyone and everything. And as readers continue through this book and then into the next book, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, learning just how utterly wicked is the witch, readers can't help but almost shudder at the thought of Charn, how she made it so ugly and foreboding with her dark, deadly magic. Well, when any novelist begins to plan a book, they engage in what is called world building. Narnia is a secondary world into which Lewis invites readers. But Charn is also another one of these worlds. And it's intended to have an effect on readers. But remember, not every built world is fictional. In Ezekiel 40 to 48, we encounter one of these built worlds. We encounter a temple. And in Ezekiel 40 verse 2, we see that Ezekiel was brought into a vision of this temple, and verse 4 specifies, "You were brought here in order that I might show it to you." From there, verse 4 says that Ezekiel is to declare it to the house of Israel. Now, this temple receives a lot of attention in debates about the end times, and we'll say more about that in our next session. But I don't think enough people factor in the purpose that we just read in verse 4. Ezekiel was brought there in order that God might show it to him. You see, this temple, this whole vision, colors Ezekiel's perspective, much like Charn colors the perspective of C.S. Lewis's readers. Although I would point out that this temple is intended to have the opposite effect on readers than Charn is. One thing that's a challenge, though, in Ezekiel 40 to 48 is the measurements and the details of this temple world, this visionary temple. I actually don't think the specific numbers have the most significance in these chapters, the actual lengths of the different things. They're not some kind of a code, but rather these individual measurements and numbers paint a broader, more impressionistic, and indeed a more symmetrical picture. And that's kind of what's supposed to grab our attention. Now, when we look at how these chapters unfold, the things are a bit more interwoven than this, but I think it's helpful to see these chapters as having a basic outward movement. It begins with the temple precincts and the altar in chapters 40 to 44, and then it moves outward to the Lord's portion, which is a district right around the temple, and then to an adjacent area belonging to the prince. We read about this in chapters 45 and 46. And then finally, it encompasses the land as a whole, as we find in chapters 47 to 48. I think that's helpful to keep in mind as you're reading through chapters 40 to 48, that outward movement. Although something else to keep in mind is as you're looking at these chapters, you also see three themes that get unpacked throughout. The temple itself is the first theme, and we find in this theme that the Lord will again dwell among his people in a cleansed sanctuary. Also shot through all these chapters is, secondly, the sacrificial and purity system of the Old Testament. Israel's relationship with the Lord will be sustained by proper practice of sacrificial rituals, by qualified and successful priestly practitioners and royal assistants. And third, a theme that is shot through these chapters is that of the land. Remember the chaos that led them into exile from the land in the first place? Well, in these chapters, we see that chaos will be replaced with an ordered and balanced life in the land that is marked by peace and harmony among the tribes, and marked by boundaries that stress the equality of the different tribes as they're centered on the Lord's temple presence. Well, when we get to chapter 40, verse 5, Ezekiel is led by this angelic messenger on a tour of the temple, and he's shown locations on a pass through the temple. And yet, in doing that, the angel is also busy measuring each location with a reed and with some kind of a linen cord. Now, on the one hand, when we think about this measuring, it shows that this temple is a gigantic structure, whereas Israel's sin was failure to guard God's holiness properly. They intruded upon God's holiness with their idolatry and with their failure to listen to his law. Their failure was especially seen as they polluted that temple back in Ezekiel 8 through 11. We see it in that vision so vividly. Well, now, this just behemoth temple is pictured as a fortress. It is unassailable. No impurity can break in and threaten God's life with his people. And these measurements depict just how magnificent is this structure. But on the other hand, the act of measuring itself is symbolic. It's a symbolic action which shows God's plan and his protective presence. This is especially evident in the book of Revelation, where it echoes Ezekiel, not only in terms of these measuring actions, but in terms of a number of other things as well. Revelation 11, verses 1 and 2 describes this, I think, in very helpful ways. There we read, "Then I was given a measuring rod like a staff, and I was told, 'Rise and measure the temple of God and the altar and those who worship there.'" Notice how the measurement affects even the people. But verse 2 says, "But do not measure the court outside the temple." Leave that out. Why? What happens by not measuring it? It says, "For it is given over to the nations, and they will trample the holy city for 42 months." You see, to measure something symbolizes divine presence and protection. And to not measure something symbolizes divine abandonment. And so what we have in this temple then is a picture of God's sovereign and perfect and permanent presence with his people, never again to be threatened by what is unholy. Now, as you read through these chapters, I ask you, what kind of world has been built in Ezekiel's vision? Is this an ominous portrait like Lewis's Charn? Or is this a bright, dazzling portrait, a world like Narnia where good reigns and where evil has no place? Well, if you need a little help, listen to the account of the Lord's glory, his kavod, coming back into the temple in 43 verses 1 to 9. We read this, "Then he led me to the gate facing east, and behold, the glory of the Lord of Israel was coming from the east, and the sound of his coming was like the sound of many waters, and the earth shone with his glory." And the vision I saw was just like the vision that I had seen when he came to destroy the city. This was references back to chapters 8 to 11. And just like the vision I had seen by the Kebar Canal. Again, this is referring back to Ezekiel chapter 1. And what happens? I fell on my face. As the glory of the Lord entered the temple by the gate facing east, the Spirit lifted me up and brought me into the inner court, and behold, the glory of the Lord filled the temple. While the man was standing beside me, I heard one speaking to me out of the temple. And he said to me, Son of man, this is the place of my throne and the place of the soles of my feet, where I will dwell in the midst of the people of Israel forever. And the house of Israel shall no more defile my holy name, neither they nor their kings, by their whoring and by the dead bodies of their kings at their high places, by setting their threshold by my threshold and their doorposts beside my doorposts, with only a wall between me and them. They have defiled my holy name by their abominations that they have committed, so I have consumed them in my anger. Now let them put away their whorings and the dead bodies of their kings far from me, and I will dwell in their midst forever. Quite a remarkable portrait, right? Presence with the Lord, no longer under threat of being punished. Well, in our remaining time in this session, let's look at two particular things. First of all, how this benefits the exiles at the time of Ezekiel, how this vision of a temple benefits the exiles, particularly how it benefits Ezekiel. But secondly, let's consider how this relates to our own Christian hope. So first, the vision of the new temple, interestingly, contains features that psychologists have observed as being helpful to people who have faced significant trauma. Bennett Simon is a retired Harvard professor of psychology, and he wrote a very stimulating study where he compared detailed measurements with coping mechanisms that were used by victims of trauma. And he did all of this in the context of looking at Ezekiel 40 to 48. Listen to what he says. In my clinical work, I've encountered people who use measurement, geometry, and precise structural detail as psychological defenses. Various forms of obsessive-compulsive behaviors, highly ordered, precisely counted, and ritualized, are often employed in the service of warding off painful effects, thoughts, and memories of traumatic events. Sufferers yearn for some geometric and arithmetic precision because their desires and passions are at times verging on the chaotic and the unbounded. The beauty and elegance of mathematics inspire awe, contrasting with the persistence of a certain ugliness in our innermost world and the external world. Geometry cleanses, orders, and puts strict, defined boundaries in place. What an interesting read on how even something like measurement might be helpful to someone who has undergone the trauma of exile. The German biblical scholar Ruth Poser has also noted that counselors often help trauma victims develop symbols of what are called safe spaces or safe places, pictures and actions and descriptions and things like that help them center their thoughts and actions on hope and a positive response to their trauma, and it keeps them from being overwhelmed by their despair. Poser suggests then that Ezekiel 40 to 48 is something like that, like an exilic coping mechanism. It's a way of concretizing one's safe place using a text, a written down vision. Now, you can imagine what you're thinking, right? I see a few puzzled looks on your faces, right? This might sound a little speculative, if not outright weird, right? What is going on here? Well, granted, God doesn't explicitly tell Ezekiel that this vision is intended as a coping mechanism for a priest who has suffered the trauma of exile. We'll fully grant that. And yet it is unquestionable that this vision is an ideal portrait of everything that the priesthood and the temple were intended to accomplish in the lives of God's people. So while we are in some measure speculating because nothing explicit is stated, let's keep in mind that these suggestions very much fit with what we understand about what the exiles went through and the trauma that they experienced. But let's go a step further. For those who think that this is weird, We need to remember that while a written description of a structure may not impress us in our world of VR headsets and remarkable computer-generated graphics, written descriptions, right, texts, were indeed highly impressive for people for the vast majority of human history. One evangelical scholar, Christopher J.H. Wright, even says that Ezekiel's temple vision is a near analogy to modern three-dimensional computer-generated virtual reality tours of museums or some other famous buildings. Now, some scholars have objected to the idea of Ezekiel having an ongoing priestly identity, as we spoke of in previous sessions. They've objected this because they say, well, he doesn't have a temple. If you don't have a temple, that makes him merely a former priest. And yet, look what we have in these passages. Look what we have in these chapters. Ezekiel does have a temple. Now, we may not feel that a textual temple is a fitting surrogate for the temple in Jerusalem, but that doesn't mean Ezekiel felt that. In fact, several biblical scholars have noted ways in which texts seem to act as like a replacement for particular spaces. It's interesting how many Leviticus scholars believe that the book of Leviticus itself is a textual projection, a textual tour of the tabernacle. So that when you read the book of Leviticus, chapter by chapter for 16 chapters, it leads the reader around the outer court before chapters 18 to 24 enter the holy place, describing matters related to ritual and righteousness and a right regulation of the priesthood. And then chapters 25 to 27 enter into the Holy of Holies by means of their correlation with Mount Sinai. We read of Mount Sinai right at the beginning of that in 25 verse 1, later in 26 verse 46, and the final verse of the book again mentions Mount Sinai. It does seem that there's a place for viewing a text as indeed, in some measure, replicating space for those who need that memory of the space. Now, I don't want to force any correlations here, but I do think we should be able to appreciate it because of something we do quite frequently in our churches. After all, when in communion we eat a crouton-sized piece of bread and we sip a tablespoon or two of wine, we recognize that this small token seals to us nothing less than our heavenly hope, seals us to Christ who feeds us with his own body and blood, and welcomes us as his bride to a great feast of food and wine described in Revelation 19, verse 9, as the marriage supper of Christ the Lamb. Again, that little piece of bread and that little cup of wine. Now, we may feel it's unimpressive, but God is in the business of spinning wisdom out of the straw of the world's folly. And so when you're struggling to cope with the challenges and perplexities of life in this world, remember that the entirety of Scripture, the entire written book of the Old and New Testaments, presents us with the true picture of the world. It world builds. It presents us with the true place where God has us safely in the palm of his hand, where Christ rules in the midst of his enemies, as Psalm 110 tells us. A world that is driving toward this consummate, glorified new creation. Ezekiel's temple vision and the textual presentation of that vision restructured the thinking of the exiles and gave them hope. Now, in our next and final session, we'll consider in more detail the ways in which Ezekiel's temple serves as our own Christian hope. And we'll see how the Apostle John's vision of the new Eden is indeed a fulfillment of all that Ezekiel saw.